The heavy oak doors of the Athenaeum Club swing open with a decisive thud that echoes through the dimly lit corridors of intellectual history. Tonight, in this sanctuary of philosophical discourse, two titans of political thought are about to clash over one of humanity's most enduring questions. Should government exist to protect the sacred rights of individuals, or must it bend to the iron will of collective necessity? The question burns at the heart of every democracy, every revolution, every moment when citizens must choose between personal freedom and social order. It is the debate that has toppled empires and birthed nations, the argument that whispers in the ear of every voter and screams from the mouths of every protester. In the amber glow of gas lamps, John Stuart Mill adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and settles into a worn leather armchair. The British philosopher carries himself with the quiet dignity of a man who has spent his life defending the rights of individuals against the crushing weight of social conformity. His fingers drum nervously against the armrest as he contemplates the evening ahead. Across the room, Niccolò Machiavelli strides with the calculated grace of a Renaissance courtier who has witnessed the rise and fall of princes. The Italian political theorist's dark eyes gleam with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who understands that noble intentions often pave the road to political catastrophe. He settles into his chair with the fluid motion of a chess master, positioning for the opening gambit. The fire crackles between them, casting dancing shadows that seem to embody the eternal tension between their opposing philosophies. Mill represents the hopeful belief that government can be a guardian of individual liberty, a careful protector of the space where human dignity flourishes. Machiavelli embodies the pragmatic understanding that effective governance sometimes requires sacrificing individual desires for the greater stability of the state. "My dear Machiavelli," Mill begins, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to parliamentary debate, "I find myself curious about your perspective on the fundamental purpose of government. Surely you must acknowledge that any legitimate authority derives its power from the consent of the governed." Machiavelli's lips curve into what might be either a smile or a grimace. "Ah, Mill, always the optimist. You speak of consent as if it were some sacred contract, but tell me, when the plague ravages Florence, when enemy armies march toward the gates, when famine threatens to tear society apart, do you ask each citizen's permission before taking the harsh measures necessary for survival? The question hangs in the air like incense, heavy with implications." Mill shifts forward, his intellectual passion beginning to ignite. "But that is precisely my point, Niccolò. It is in those moments of crisis that we most need the protection of fundamental rights. History shows us that emergency powers, once granted, have a terrible tendency to become permanent fixtures of tyranny. History," Machiavelli counters, swirling an imaginary glass of wine, "also shows us that societies paralyzed by endless debate over individual rights often fall to those willing to make decisive choices. The Roman Republic died not from too much authority, but from too little effective governance. The debate has begun in earnest now, two brilliant minds circling each other like gladiators in an arena of ideas." Mill's belief in the sanctity of individual liberty faces off against Machiavelli's hard-nosed realism about the necessities of power. The question that brought them together, whether government should protect natural rights or enforce collective will, begins to reveal its profound complexity. Mill leans back, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he prepares his response. "You speak of effectiveness, but effectiveness toward what end? A government that tramples individual rights in pursuit of collective goals may achieve temporary stability, but it does so at the cost of human dignity itself. And a government that allows individual whims to override collective necessity," Machiavelli replies with theatrical flourish, "may preserve abstract dignity while watching its citizens starve in the streets." Tell me, Mill, what dignity exists in a failed state? The philosophical battle lines are drawn. Two of history's greatest political thinkers sit mere feet apart, separated by centuries of time, but united in their passionate commitment to understanding the proper role of government. Mill's humanitarian liberalism stands ready to defend the fortress of individual rights, while Machiavelli's pragmatic realism prepares to demonstrate why collective will must sometimes override individual preferences. The evening promises to be a war of ideas, fought with words as sharp as any sword, and convictions as strong as any army. The question they grapple with is not merely academic, it is the living, breathing dilemma that faces every society, every generation, every moment when the needs of the many collide with the rights of the few. Mill's fingers steeple as he gathers his thoughts, the weight of centuries of liberal philosophy resting on his shoulders. The warmth from the fireplace seems to energize him, as if the flames themselves were kindling his passion for individual liberty. "Niccolo, my friend, I fear you misunderstand the very foundation of legitimate government," Mill begins, his voice gaining strength like a river approaching rapids. "Government exists not as master over subjects, but as servant to citizens. The moment we accept that authority can rightfully override individual conscience without overwhelming justification, we surrender the very essence of human dignity." Machiavelli leans forward, his eyes narrowing with predatory interest. "Servant to citizens? How charmingly naive. Tell me, when your English Parliament banned the import of opium, did they first consult each individual citizen? When they implemented factory safety regulations, did they ask permission from every mill owner who preferred cheaper, more dangerous operations? Those examples prove my point rather than yours," Mill responds, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who has spent decades refining his arguments. Government intervention is justified when individual actions cause harm to others. The harm principle provides the clear boundary. We are free to act as we choose until our actions begin to damage others. Factory owners have no right to endanger their workers for profit, just as opium merchants have no right to profit from human misery. The Italian theorist's laugh carries the bitter edge of someone who has witnessed too many high-minded principles crumble under political pressure. "Ah yes, your famous harm principle, but who determines what constitutes harm? Who decides when the greater good overrides individual preference? You have simply pushed the question back one level without resolving it." Mill stands and begins to pace, his scholarly energy filling the room like steam from a kettle. The determination of harm must be made through democratic deliberation, with the heaviest possible burden of proof on those who would restrict individual liberty. We must err on the side of freedom, not control. "Democratic deliberation," Machiavelli repeats, savoring the words like a wine connoisseur detecting notes of idealism. "And what happens when democratic deliberation produces results that violate your cherished individual rights? What happens when the majority votes to silence the minority, to confiscate property, to impose religious conformity?" The question strikes at the heart of Mill's philosophical system, and he knows it. His pacing slows as he considers the challenge. This is precisely why we need constitutional protections, bills of rights, institutional safeguards that place certain fundamental freedoms beyond the reach of temporary majorities. Constitutional protections, Machiavelli muses, written by whom? Interpreted by whom? Enforced by whom? You speak as if these parchment barriers possess some mystical power to constrain human ambition and political necessity. Mill's response comes with the passion of someone defending his life's work. They possess the power we give them through our commitment to the principles they embody. A society that truly values individual liberty will create institutions that protect it, just as a society that values collective security will create institutions that enforce it. "Now we approach the truth," Machiavelli says, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "You admit that the protection of individual rights depends entirely on society's commitment to protecting them. But what happens when that commitment wavers? What happens when external threats or internal crises make individual rights seem like luxuries the society can no longer afford?" The firelight flickers across Mill's face as he confronts this fundamental challenge to his philosophy. Then we discover what we truly value. A society that abandons individual rights in the face of crisis never truly valued them in the first place. The test of our principles comes not in easy times, but in moments of genuine difficulty. Machiavelli's smile broadens, revealing the satisfaction of a hunter who has cornered his prey. How wonderfully idealistic. But tell me, Mill, when enemy armies march toward London, when plague threatens to decimate the population, when economic collapse threatens to throw millions into starvation, will you comfort the dying with speeches about individual liberty? I will comfort them with the knowledge that we have not sacrificed our humanity in the name of survival," Mill replies, his voice steady despite the philosophical storm raging around him. What value is a society that preserves its physical existence by destroying its moral foundation? The debate has reached a crucial juncture. Mill's liberal philosophy stands exposed to one of its most persistent criticisms, that it may be too pure, too idealistic for the messy realities of political life. Yet he refuses to retreat, holding fast to his conviction that individual rights represent something sacred, something that must be protected even when protection seems costly or impractical. Machiavelli circles his opponent like a skilled debater sensing weakness. Moral foundation? You speak as if morality exists in some realm separate from human survival and flourishing. But morality without effectiveness is mere posturing, and effectiveness without adaptability is mere stubbornness. The philosophical battle intensifies as two great minds clash over the fundamental question of whether government should serve as the guardian of individual rights or the enforcer of collective necessity. Machiavelli moves to the window, gazing out into the London fog as if seeing through it into the corridors of power where his theories have played out across centuries. When he turns back to face Mill, his expression carries the weight of someone who has witnessed the brutal arithmetic of political survival. "My dear Mill," he begins, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a Renaissance diplomat, "your faith in individual rights is admirable, but it rests on a dangerous assumption that society is a debating club where reasonable people gather to discuss abstract principles. The world I know is far messier, far more dangerous, and far less forgiving of philosophical purity." Mill settles back into his chair, recognizing that his opponent is preparing a sustained assault on liberal idealism. "I do not deny the complexities of governance, Niccolo, but complexity cannot be an excuse for abandoning fundamental principles. Indeed, it is precisely because governance is complex that we need clear moral guidelines." "Clear moral guidelines," Machiavelli repeats, his tone suggesting he finds the phrase both amusing and troubling. "Let me tell you about clear moral guidelines. In 1503, Cesare Borgia faced a rebellion in the Romagna. The rebels had legitimate grievances: heavy taxation, arbitrary justice, cruel administrators. By your principles, Borgia should have addressed their concerns through democratic deliberation and respect for individual rights." The Italian theorist begins to pace, his movements conveying the restless energy of someone recounting a story with profound implications. Instead, Borgia appointed Ramiro de Orco as governor with unlimited powers to restore order. De Orco succeeded through methods that would horrify your liberal sensibilities: executions, confiscations, brutal suppression of dissent. Then, to distance himself from these harsh measures, Borgia had de Orco executed in the town square. Mill's face shows his distaste for the story, but he remains silent, knowing that Machiavelli is building toward a larger point. The result? Machiavelli continues, his voice rising with dramatic effect. "Peace returned to the Romagna. Trade resumed. Families could sleep safely in their beds. The harsh measures that violated individual rights ultimately created the conditions where individual rights could be exercised." Which approach better served the people, respecting their rights while they suffered under chaos, or temporarily suspending those rights to create lasting stability? Mill's response comes with the measured cadence of someone who has considered such scenarios deeply. "You present a false choice, Niccolo. The temporary suspension of rights has a troubling tendency to become permanent. History offers countless examples of leaders who justified tyranny as a temporary measure necessary for the greater good. And history offers equally numerous examples of societies that collapsed because they could not act decisively when action was required." Machiavelli counters. "The Roman Republic, which you doubtless admire for its constitutional protections, spent its final decades paralyzed by procedural disputes while enemies gathered at the gates. Augustus succeeded where the Republic failed precisely because he was willing to concentrate power and act without endless consultation. The philosophical tension in the room grows palpable as two fundamentally different visions of government clash. Mill shifts forward, his intellectual passion fully engaged. But Augustus's success came at the cost of republican institutions that had served Rome for centuries. He may have brought peace, but he also brought autocracy. Can we really call that success?" "We can call it survival," Machiavelli replies with brutal simplicity. "And survival is the prerequisite for all other political goods, including your cherished individual rights. A dead citizen enjoys no rights at all." Mill's voice carries increasing urgency as he responds. "Yet a citizen who lives under tyranny enjoys no meaningful rights either. You speak of effectiveness, but effective toward what end? If government exists merely to perpetuate its own power and maintain order, it becomes nothing more than an elaborate prison system." Machiavelli's eyes flash with something that might be admiration for his opponent's tenacity. "No, Mill. Government exists to create the conditions where human flourishing becomes possible. Sometimes this requires protecting individual rights. Sometimes it requires overriding them. The art of statecraft lies in knowing which situation demands which response. But who makes that determination? Mill demands, his voice rising with frustration. Who decides when individual rights must be sacrificed for collective necessity? In your system, it seems that power itself becomes the final arbiter of justice. The question strikes at the heart of Machiavelli's philosophy, and the Italian thinker pauses, considering his response carefully. Power guided by wisdom and constrained by necessity. The effective ruler understands that tyranny is often self-defeating, that excessive cruelty breeds rebellion, that some measure of popular support is essential for stable governance. Constrained by necessity, Mill repeats, his tone suggesting he finds this constraint insufficient. But necessity is notoriously flexible. Throughout history, rulers have discovered that almost any action can be justified as necessary if one is creative enough in defining the threat. The debate has reached a critical juncture where the fundamental assumptions underlying each philosophy stand exposed. Mill's commitment to individual rights as inviolable principles faces Machiavelli's pragmatic acceptance that all principles must sometimes yield to political reality. The fire has burned lower now, casting longer shadows across the room as the two philosophers enter the most intense phase of their intellectual combat. Mill stands abruptly, his scholarly composure finally showing cracks under the pressure of defending his deepest convictions. Niccolo, I fear you have constructed a philosophy that justifies anything and everything, Mill declares, his voice carrying the sharp edge of moral indignation. If necessity can override any principle, if effectiveness matters more than justice, then what separates the wise ruler from the clever tyrant? What prevents your philosophy from becoming a handbook for despotism? Machiavelli's response comes with the cool confidence of someone who has faced this accusation countless times. The difference, my idealistic friend, lies in understanding the true nature of effectiveness. A tyrant who rules through fear alone creates instability. A wise ruler understands that lasting power requires some measure of popular consent, some degree of justice, some attention to the genuine needs of the people. Some measure, some degree, some attention, Mill repeats, his words dripping with skepticism. How conveniently vague. Your philosophy provides no meaningful limits on governmental power, no clear boundaries that cannot be crossed in the name of necessity. The Italian theorist moves closer to the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. And your philosophy provides no meaningful way to deal with genuine emergencies, no clear mechanism for choosing between competing rights, no practical guidance for rulers who must make impossible decisions with incomplete information. Mill's pacing becomes more agitated as he confronts this challenge. Democratic deliberation provides that mechanism. When we face difficult choices, we turn to the collective wisdom of the people, guided by constitutional principles and constrained by respect for minority rights. Democratic deliberation, Machiavelli says, his voice heavy with skepticism. Tell me, how well did democratic deliberation serve Germany in the 1930s? How effectively did it prevent the rise of fascism when economic crisis and political instability created the conditions for extremism? The question hangs in the air like a challenge thrown down between dueling knights. Mill's face shows the strain of confronting one of liberalism's most troubling historical failures. The rise of fascism proves my point rather than yours, Mill responds, though his voice lacks its earlier certainty. Democratic institutions failed in Germany precisely because they were not strong enough, because constitutional protections were not deeply enough rooted, because the commitment to individual rights was not sufficiently widespread. Machiavelli's laugh carries no humor, only the bitter recognition of political reality. Or perhaps democratic institutions failed because they were too rigid, too slow, too bound by procedural niceties to address the genuine grievances that extremists exploited. Perhaps what Germany needed was not more democracy, but more effective governance. The philosophical battle has reached its climax, with both thinkers pushed to the extremes of their positions. Mill's voice rises with passionate conviction. Effective governance that tramples individual rights is not governance at all. It is organized oppression, a society that sacrifices its commitment to human dignity for the sake of efficiency has lost its soul, and a society that clings to abstract principles while its people suffer has lost its purpose. Machiavelli counters with equal fervor. You speak of human dignity as if it exists in some realm separate from material welfare, physical security, and social stability. But dignity without bread is hollow comfort, and rights without order are meaningless promises. Mill stops pacing and faces his opponent directly, his entire philosophical system at stake. Then we have reached the fundamental divide between us. You believe that rights are privileges granted by effective government. I believe that rights are inherent in human nature and that government exists to protect them. I believe, Machiavelli responds, his voice steady but intense, that rights are claims that have meaning only within stable societies, and that stable societies sometimes require the temporary suspension of individual claims for the sake of collective survival. Your natural rights are beautiful in theory, but they exist only where power makes them possible. The room falls silent except for the crackling of the dying fire. Two of history's greatest political philosophers have laid bare the fundamental tension between individual liberty and collective necessity, between moral principle and political pragmatism, between the rights of persons and the needs of society. Mill's voice, when he finally speaks, carries the weight of someone who recognizes the profound difficulty of the questions they are grappling with. Perhaps the real question is not whether government should protect individual rights or enforce collective will, but how we can create institutions that balance both imperatives without losing sight of either. Machiavelli nods slowly, his expression suggesting grudging respect for his opponent's insight. Now you begin to think like a true student of politics rather than a mere philosopher. The art of governance lies not in choosing between absolutes, but in finding workable compromises between competing necessities. The debate has evolved from a clash of opposing certainties into a more nuanced exploration of the permanent tensions that define political life. As the fire burns lower, casting deeper shadows across the room, both philosophers seem to sense that their debate has reached a crucial turning point. The initial clash of ideologies has given way to something more profound, a recognition that the questions they grapple with have no easy answers, no clean solutions that satisfy both moral principle and political necessity. Mill returns to his chair, his earlier agitation replaced by a thoughtful intensity. You raise a troubling point about the relationship between rights and power, Niccolo. I have always maintained that rights exist independently of government recognition, but I must admit that their practical exercise depends on institutions capable of protecting them. Machiavelli settles opposite him, his expression showing the satisfaction of someone who has forced his opponent to confront uncomfortable truths. Finally, you begin to grapple with the real world, rather than the world as we might wish it to be. Rights without power are mere wishes. Power without legitimacy is mere tyranny. The art of statecraft lies in combining both. But there lies the terrible paradox. Mill continues, his voice growing more urgent. The very power needed to protect rights can easily become the power to destroy them. How do we create institutions strong enough to defend liberty without becoming strong enough to threaten it? The question strikes at the heart of political theory, and both men recognize its profound implications. Machiavelli leans forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight like a predator sensing opportunity. You have stumbled upon the central dilemma of all political organization, he says, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of political experience. Every government faces the same impossible choice: remain weak and risk collapse, or grow strong and risk tyranny. There is no perfect solution, only the endless navigation between competing dangers. Mill's response reveals the depth of his intellectual struggle. Yet surely we can learn from history, develop better institutions, create more effective checks and balances. The American system of separated powers, the British tradition of parliamentary sovereignty, constrained by constitutional convention, these represent genuine advances in the art of limiting governmental power while maintaining effectiveness. Do they? Machiavelli challenges, his voice carrying skeptical authority. The American system has given us civil war, racial oppression, and the systematic violation of individual rights whenever national security is perceived to be at stake. The British system has produced empire, exploitation, and the subordination of individual conscience to parliamentary will. Your celebrated liberal institutions have their own dark histories. The accusation stings precisely because Mill knows it contains uncomfortable truths. His voice, when he responds, carries the pain of someone forced to confront the failures of his own ideals. I do not claim that liberal institutions are perfect, only that they represent the best hope for balancing individual liberty with collective necessity. The alternative, accepting that power makes right, that effectiveness justifies any means, leads inevitably to despotism. Machiavelli's response comes with devastating simplicity, and your alternative, insisting that right constrains power, that principle limits effectiveness, leads inevitably to weakness, chaos, and eventual collapse. We are both describing paths to failure, merely different types of failure. The recognition hangs between them like a verdict neither wanted to hear. Two of history's most brilliant political thinkers have talked themselves into a philosophical corner where every solution seems to create new problems, where every principle seems to generate its own contradictions. Mill's voice, barely above a whisper, carries the weight of profound uncertainty. Then perhaps the question is not how to solve these contradictions, but how to live with them. Perhaps the best we can hope for is not perfect institutions, but institutions that fail in bearable ways. Now you speak like a true student of politics, Machiavelli responds, his tone carrying grudging admiration. The art of governance is not about achieving perfection, but about managing imperfection. It is not about eliminating the tension between individual liberty and collective necessity, but about maintaining that tension in productive ways. The fire crackles lower, and both men seem to recognize that their debate has reached a deeper level of understanding. They have moved beyond the simple clash of opposing ideologies into the more complex territory where philosophical principles meet political reality. But this raises another question, Mill continues, his analytical mind still working despite his emotional exhaustion. If we accept that all political systems involve tragic choices, how do we decide which tragedies are acceptable? How do we choose between the failures of excessive liberty and the failures of excessive order? Machiavelli's answer comes with the finality of someone who has wrestled with these questions throughout his career. We choose based on the circumstances we face, the threats we confront, and the values we are willing to sacrifice for the values we are determined to preserve. There is no universal formula, no permanent solution, only the endless burden of making impossible choices with inadequate information. The conversation has revealed something neither philosopher expected, that their apparent opposition masks a deeper agreement about the tragic nature of political life. The dying embers cast a warm glow across the room as both philosophers sit in contemplative silence, each processing the implications of their extended debate. The initial antagonism has mellowed into something approaching mutual respect, even as their fundamental disagreements remain unresolved. Mill breaks the silence, his voice carrying a thoughtful quality that suggests deeper reflection. I find myself wondering, Niccolo, whether we have been debating false alternatives. Perhaps the question is not whether government should protect individual rights or enforce collective will, but how it can do both simultaneously. Machiavelli raises an eyebrow, his expression suggesting both interest and skepticism. An intriguing proposition, but how do you propose to serve two masters who often demand contradictory actions? When individual rights conflict with collective necessity, someone must choose which takes precedence. True, Mill acknowledges, but perhaps the key lies not in establishing a permanent hierarchy, but in creating institutions that can navigate these conflicts case by case, with appropriate deliberation and sufficient safeguards against abuse. The Italian theorist considers this carefully, his political instincts evaluating the practical implications. You are describing a system that would be simultaneously strong enough to act decisively when necessary, and restrained enough to protect individual liberty when possible. The difficulty lies in determining who makes these determinations and how they are held accountable. Mill's eyes light up with the enthusiasm of someone developing a new insight. Democratic institutions, properly structured, can provide both elements. Popular sovereignty ensures that collective will has ultimate authority, while constitutional constraints ensure that individual rights cannot be casually overridden. But we have already established that democratic institutions can produce tyrannical results, Machiavelli reminds him. The majority can oppress the minority just as effectively as any autocrat, sometimes more effectively because they can claim democratic legitimacy, which is why we need more than simple majority rule, Mill responds, his voice gaining strength as he develops his argument. We need deliberative democracy, institutions that force citizens to confront competing perspectives, to consider the rights of minorities, to grapple with the long-term consequences of their choices. Machiavelli's expression shows grudging interest in this concept, deliberative democracy. The idea has merit, but it assumes that people are capable of reasoning beyond their immediate interests, that they will voluntarily constrain their own power for the sake of abstract principles. History suggests that people are capable of such reasoning, when institutions encourage it, Mill argues. The abolition of slavery, the extension of voting rights, the development of international humanitarian law, these represent genuine moral progress achieved through democratic deliberation. And history also suggests that such progress is fragile, easily reversed when circumstances change, Machiavelli counters. The same democratic institutions that extended rights in good times have contracted them in times of crisis. Your faith in deliberative democracy may be as naive as your faith in natural rights. The exchange reveals the persistent tension between idealistic hope and realistic pessimism that has characterized their entire debate. Yet both men seem to recognize that they are approaching something resembling a workable synthesis. Mill leans forward, his voice carrying the passion of someone who sees a path through the philosophical maze. Perhaps the key insight is that neither pure individualism nor pure collectivism is sustainable. We need systems that can protect individual rights when possible and override them when genuinely necessary, but only with the highest burden of proof and the strongest safeguards against abuse. Machiavelli nods slowly, his political experience recognizing the wisdom in this approach. To a system that defaults to protecting individual liberty, but can shift to enforcing collective will when survival is at stake. The challenge lies in defining what constitutes a genuine threat to survival and preventing leaders from manufacturing such threats to justify their own power. Exactly, Mill agrees. We need institutions that are skeptical of claims about necessity, that demand evidence for assertions about collective threat, that insist on the least restrictive means necessary to address genuine emergencies. The fire has burned down to glowing coals, but the intellectual energy in the room remains high, as both philosophers recognize that they may be approaching a genuine synthesis of their opposing positions. Machiavelli's voice carries a note of cautious optimism. What you are describing is not a perfect solution, but perhaps a workable one. A system that acknowledges the permanent tension between individual liberty and collective necessity, without trying to resolve it permanently in favor of either principle. A system that embraces the tragic nature of political choice while still insisting on moral constraints, Mill adds. One that recognizes that we cannot eliminate the need for difficult decisions, but we can create institutions that make such decisions more thoughtfully and with greater accountability. The philosophical battle that began with sharp disagreement has evolved into something approaching collaboration, as both thinkers recognize the complexity of the challenges they face. The grandfather clock in the corner strikes midnight, its sonorous chimes marking the passage of time as the two philosophers realize their debate has consumed the entire evening. Yet neither seems eager to conclude their discussion, sensing that they have reached insights that neither could have achieved alone. Mill stretches in his chair, his scholarly frame showing the effects of hours of intense intellectual combat. You know, Niccolo, I entered this discussion believing that individual rights were absolute, inviolable principles that no government could rightfully override. Our conversation has forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most sacred principles must sometimes yield to overwhelming necessity. Machiavelli smiles, but his expression carries more thoughtfulness than triumph. And I entered believing that effectiveness was the sole criterion for judging governmental action, that results justified any means. Your arguments have reminded me that effectiveness without legitimacy is ultimately self-defeating, that power without moral foundation cannot sustain itself indefinitely. The admission represents a remarkable evolution in their thinking, a movement from rigid positions toward more nuanced understanding. Mill rises and walks to the window, gazing out into the London night as he continues his reflection. Perhaps the most important insight from our discussion is that the question itself, whether government should protect individual rights or enforce collective will, is wrongly framed. The real question is how government can do both responsibly, with appropriate safeguards and adequate accountability. Machiavelli joins him at the window, both men looking out into the darkness as if seeing the future challenges that will test their insights. The synthesis we have discovered tonight is not a solution, but a framework, a way of thinking about political problems that acknowledges their complexity without surrendering to either cynicism or naivety. A framework that insists on high standards for overriding individual rights, while recognizing that such overriding may sometimes be necessary, Mill adds. One that demands evidence for claims about collective necessity, while accepting that such necessity can be genuine. The Italian theorist nods thoughtfully. Most importantly, a framework that places the burden of proof on those who would restrict liberty, that insists on transparency in governmental decision-making, and that maintains robust institutions for holding power accountable. As they stand together in the lamplight, the philosophical adversaries have become something approaching collaborators in the endless task of understanding political life. Their debate has not resolved the fundamental tension between individual liberty and collective necessity, but it has illuminated ways of managing that tension more thoughtfully. Mill's voice carries a note of wistful recognition. The tragedy of political life is that there are no perfect solutions, only better and worse ways of managing inevitable conflicts. The question is not how to eliminate difficult choices, but how to make them more wisely, and the wisdom to recognize that today's solution may become tomorrow's problem. Machiavelli adds, political institutions must be capable of evolution, of adapting to new circumstances, while maintaining their core commitments to both individual dignity and collective welfare. The fire has burned down to barely glowing embers, but the intellectual flame kindled by their discussion continues to burn brightly. Both philosophers recognize that their conversation represents not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a more sophisticated way of thinking about the eternal questions of political life. Mill turns from the window, his expression showing both exhaustion and exhilaration. Future generations will face these same questions in new forms. They will need to balance individual liberty against collective security, personal freedom against social responsibility, democratic ideals against practical necessities. They will need the wisdom to avoid both the tyranny of unconstrained power and the chaos of unlimited liberty, Machiavelli responds. Most of all, they will need the humility to recognize that political life involves tragic choices and the courage to make those choices responsibly. The two great thinkers shake hands in the dying light, their disagreements unresolved, but their understanding deepened. They have not answered the question that brought them together, but they have demonstrated how such questions might be approached more thoughtfully. The eternal tension between individual rights and collective will remains, as it must in any free society. But their debate has shown that this tension need not be destructive if it is managed by institutions committed to both individual dignity and collective welfare, guided by principles that acknowledge the complexity of political life while maintaining clear moral boundaries. As they prepare to part ways, both philosophers understand that their conversation will continue in the minds of future citizens, lawmakers, and leaders who must wrestle with the same fundamental questions about the proper role of government in human society. The debate between Mill and Machiavelli ends, but the larger conversation about liberty and authority, rights and responsibilities, individual dignity and collective necessity continues into the uncertain future.